Hello and welcome to another journey through time. If you enjoy relaxing explorations of history, science, and the human mind, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from and what time it is right now. Whether it's late at night or early in the morning, we're so glad to have you here. Now, let's step back in time, all the way to 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago, the Earth was emerging from the last ice age. Massive sheets of ice that had once covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia were slowly retreating, revealing a landscape scarred by millennia of glaciation. The air was warming, the world was changing, and with it, so were the lives of the humans who inhabited it. Imagine waking up on a chilly morning in a small shelter made of mammoth bones and animal hides. You and your family are part of a small nomadic group, just a few dozen people. You've followed the herds for generations, learning the rhythms of nature, moving with the seasons, hunting, gathering, surviving. The Ice Age had shaped humanity for tens of thousands of years. Our ancestors had learned to adapt to a harsh, cold world. They used stone tools, crafted clothing from animal hides, and worked together in tight-knit groups to ensure survival. But now, the environment was shifting, and with it, the course of human history. As glaciers receded, new ecosystems began to emerge. Vast tundras gave way to dense forests. Rivers changed course. Grasslands expanded. Animals migrated. Some species, like the woolly mammoth and the saber-toothed cat, began to disappear. Others thrived in the new climate, and for humans, these changes posed a challenge, but also an opportunity. The warmer climate allowed for more stable food sources. Where once people had moved constantly in search of game, they could now find areas rich in plants, fish, and smaller animals. Some began to settle, if only temporarily. Campsites became seasonal homes. Caves became communities. This was a turning point in human history, the cusp between the Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age, and the Neolithic, or New Stone Age. It was the beginning of something entirely new. Let's take a closer look at what life was like around the world during this time. The Levant, birthplace of agriculture. In the region we now call the Middle East, stretching from modern-day Israel and Palestine through Syria, Jordan, and into Iraq, humans were beginning to experiment with something revolutionary: farming. Known as the Natufians, these people lived in permanent or semi-permanent villages. They built stone houses, stored food, and began cultivating wild grains like barley and wheat. They were still hunter-gatherers, but they were beginning to rely more on what they could grow and store. Imagine walking through a small Natufian settlement. The homes are modest, made of stone and clay, with thatched roofs. Outside, people are grinding grain with stones, collecting water from a nearby spring, and tending to small garden plots. Inside, families cook over open fires, telling stories of the hunt, the harvest, and the spirits they believe inhabit the land. They bury their dead beneath the floors of their homes, honoring ancestors and maintaining a connection between the living and the dead. This early agricultural experiment was not yet full-scale farming, but it was a crucial step toward it. Over time, humans in this region began domesticating animals like goats and sheep, turning a revolutionary idea into a new way of life. Europe. Life in the forests. In Europe, the retreat of the glaciers transformed the land. Once barren tundras became lush forests, home to red deer, wild boar, and countless bird species. Humans here remained largely hunter-gatherers, but they were becoming more skilled, more organized, and more artistic. In places like what is now France and Spain, humans created breathtaking cave art, depictions of bison, horses, and abstract symbols that still baffle archaeologists today. These weren't just decorations. They were part of a complex spiritual and social life. Perhaps rituals were held deep in the caves, far from sunlight, where flickering torches made the paintings dance on the walls. Villages in Mesolithic Europe were still mobile, but increasingly, people returned to the same spots year after year. Evidence shows they were building semi-permanent dwellings, crafting refined tools from bone and stone, and creating personal ornaments, necklaces made from animal teeth, pendants carved from bone. These were people who had deep knowledge of their environment. They followed the seasons. They knew when the salmon would return to spawn, when the deer would migrate, when the berries would ripen. Their calendars were the stars, the moon, the subtle signs of nature. Asia. Innovation and expansion. In East Asia, similar patterns were unfolding. In what is now China, early communities were forming near rivers, particularly the Yellow River and the Yangtze. People here were among the first to domesticate rice, an innovation that would transform the region for millennia. To the north, in what is now Siberia, nomadic groups lived in challenging conditions. They hunted mammoths, reindeer, and bison, crafting tools and shelter suited for the cold. As the ice receded, some began to migrate further into Eurasia, following the herds and the rivers. In the steppes of Central Asia, vast open landscapes stretched as far as the eye could see. Here, humans developed a way of life that emphasized mobility. They lived in tents, followed animals across great distances, and developed a deep relationship with the land. These cultures would one day give rise to powerful horse-riding civilizations, but for now, they were small, resilient groups, thriving in the new post-glacial world. Africa, the cradle of humanity, continues to thrive. In Africa, the birthplace of our species, human societies were diverse and vibrant. In the Nile Valley, people were gathering wild grains and fish from the river. In the highlands of Ethiopia, they were beginning to cultivate crops like teff. In the Sahel, nomadic groups hunted and gathered across vast savannas. The Sahara, which today is a vast desert, was then a lush, green landscape filled with lakes and rivers. Archaeologists have found rock art in the Sahara depicting giraffes, elephants, and even swimming humans, evidence of a wetter, more hospitable climate. In southern Africa, the San people, whose descendants still live today, created intricate rock art, practiced complex rituals, and lived in harmony with the land. Their deep understanding of ecology, medicine, and storytelling is a legacy that continues to this day. The Americas, adapting to new worlds. Across the vast expanse of the Americas, human beings were adapting to an incredible range of environments. From the frozen tundra of what is now Alaska to the tropical forests of the Amazon, people had spread far and wide. In North America, groups like the Clovis people hunted mammoths and mastodons using finely crafted stone tools. But as the megafauna began to disappear, either from overhunting, climate change, or both, people adapted. They began to rely more on smaller animals, fish, and plant foods. In Mesoamerica, the ancestors of the Maya and the Olmec were learning to cultivate squash, beans, and early forms of maize. Though full-scale agriculture was still thousands of years away, the foundations were being laid. In South America, humans lived along the coast, fishing in the rich Pacific waters. Others made their homes in the Andes, developing high-altitude adaptations and complex knowledge of the mountainous terrain. Australia and the Pacific. The dream time continues. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples had lived for tens of thousands of years, developing one of the world's oldest continuous cultures. Their understanding of the land, its cycles, its sacred places, was expressed through song, dance, and oral tradition. 10,000 years ago, they were adapting to a drying climate. Rising sea levels had separated Tasmania from the mainland. The Great Lake Mungo had begun to dry up. Yet the people endured, drawing on knowledge passed down through countless generations. Farther out into the Pacific, humans had not yet reached most of the islands. But soon, the great seafaring journeys would begin. Voyages that would eventually populate the vast triangle, stretching from Hawaii to New Zealand to Easter Island. A world on the edge of transformation. And so, around 10,000 years ago, the world stood at the threshold of a great transformation. The earth was healing from an age of ice. Humans were everywhere, learning, adapting, surviving. Some were planting the first seeds of agriculture. Others continued the nomadic life that had sustained our species for so long. All were part of a species poised to change the planet forever. The story of humanity changed forever when our ancestors stopped wandering and began to stay in one place, not for days or weeks, but for months, then years. This profound shift, known as the agricultural revolution, began around 10,000 years ago, and it slowly spread from one corner of the earth to another. It was not a single event, but a series of quiet discoveries that would ripple through generations. Why did humans start farming? It was not because life as hunter-gatherers had become impossible. On the contrary, many lived well for tens of thousands of years without domesticating a single plant. But something changed. As the climate warmed and environment stabilized, wild plants like wheat, barley, lentils, and peas flourished in abundance, especially in a region known as the Fertile Crescent. This arc of land, stretching from modern-day Iraq through Syria, Jordan, Israel, and into Egypt, provided the perfect balance of soil, water, and biodiversity. People began to observe patterns in nature. They noticed that seeds grew into plants. They learned that if they harvested grains at the right time and planted some of the seeds nearby, new crops would sprout. Over time, they selected the strongest seeds, choosing traits like larger kernels or faster growth. This process, called domestication, marked the beginning of true agriculture. From gathering to growing. The shift from foraging to farming was gradual. People didn't one day abandon the hunt and start planting fields. Instead, they combined both lifestyles. They gathered wild plants and hunted wild animals, but they also began to sow seeds and stay longer in places where food was abundant. One of the earliest known agricultural villages is Jericho, located near the Jordan River. Around 9000 BCE, people here built stone houses, stored grain in pits, and surrounded their settlement with a massive stone wall, possibly for protection or to control flooding. Imagine the daily rhythm of life in Jericho. Waking with the sun, tending to barley fields, gathering herbs along the riverbanks, grinding wheat with a stone mortar, shaping clay into pots, drying dates in the sun. Children played in the dust. Elders told stories under the stars. Dogs, among the first domesticated animals, lay sleeping by the fireside. This was a different kind of life. It was slower, more rooted, but it also introduced new complexities. The first domesticated animals. At the same time that humans were planting crops, they began to tame animals. It likely started with the wolf. Some wolves, less aggressive than others, began to scavenge near human camps. Humans may have seen the value in these early dogs, not just as companions, but as guards, trackers, and helpers in the hunt. From there, the relationship between humans and animals deepened. In the highlands of the Fertile Crescent, people began to domesticate goats and sheep. These animals provided milk, meat, wool, and even helped clear land. Later came cattle and pigs, which were more difficult to manage, but incredibly valuable. To domesticate an animal meant not only to tame it, but to breed it for specific traits, docility, productivity, size, or strength. Over generations, animals changed. They became dependent on humans, and in turn, humans depended on them. With animals came new tools, plows pulled by oxen, milk containers, bone needles for sewing wool clothing. Societies grew more complex, more inventive. How agriculture changed society. Farming changed everything. Not just how people ate, but how they lived, thought, and related to one another. In a hunter-gatherer society, people were generally egalitarian. No one owned the land, and leadership was shared. But farming required land, and the land became something that could be owned, inherited, or fought over. With permanent homes came property. With grain storage came surpluses. With surpluses came power. Some individuals began to rise in status, not because they were the best hunters or the wisest elders, but because they controlled food, land, or water. Early hierarchies began to form. Farming also brought about larger populations. With a more stable food supply, more children could survive. Villages grew into towns. Towns would one day grow into cities. But the agricultural revolution had a darker side too. New struggles, health and conflict. While farming allowed for more food, it didn't always mean better health. In fact, early farmers often had shorter lifespans and more diseases than their foraging ancestors. Why? Early diets became less diverse. Instead of eating dozens of plants and animals, many farmers relied heavily on a few grains like wheat or rice. This led to nutritional deficiencies. Living in close quarters, often with animals nearby, meant diseases spread more easily. Tuberculosis, smallpox, and other infections likely emerged during this period. And as communities grew, so did conflict. There was more to defend. Homes, crops, livestock. Raids became more common. Walls, like those at Jericho, became a necessity. Farming allowed for civilization, but it also introduced war, inequality, and environmental strain. Beyond the Fertile Crescent. Though the Fertile Crescent is often cited as the birthplace of agriculture, similar revolutions were happening around the world independently. In China, people began cultivating millet in the north and rice in the south. Early villages near the Yangtze River developed irrigation and pottery. In the thousands of years to come, these innovations would support massive populations and complex empires. In New Guinea, people cultivated taro, bananas, and sugarcane, developing sophisticated methods of managing steep mountain gardens. In Africa, the Sahel region became a cradle of agriculture with early farming of sorghum, millet, and yams. In West Africa, oil palms and okra were cultivated. The Nile Valley also became home to early farmers who combined fishing, hunting, and agriculture in a dynamic mix. In the Americas, agriculture arose in several places. In Mexico, people began cultivating squash, beans, and maize, the ancient ancestor of modern corn. In Peru, early farmers grew potatoes, quinoa, and cotton. Each region developed its own unique crops suited to its climate and culture. These separate agricultural traditions would one day connect through trade, exploration, and empire. But at this time, they were worlds apart, each evolving in its own rhythm. A new relationship with time, With farming came a new concept of time. For hunter-gatherers, time was cyclical. The rising and setting of the sun, the phases of the moon, the passing of the seasons. But for farmers, schedules became crucial. Planting had to happen at the right moment. Harvesting could not be missed. People began to study the skies more carefully. They built early calendars. They watched the stars for signs of change. Some of the first astronomers were likely farmers trying to predict the rains. This new awareness of time influenced not just agriculture, but religion, ritual, and mythology. Many ancient myths tell of gods of grain, of harvest, of sun and moon. These stories reflect a deepening connection between humans, the earth, and the forces that governed their survival. The long view. The agricultural revolution did not happen overnight. It took millennia. For thousands of years, farming and foraging coexisted. In some places, like the Amazon or the Arctic, foraging remained the dominant way of life. Even today, in a few remote parts of the world, hunter-gatherer societies persist, living as echoes of an ancient human rhythm. But for most of humanity, 10,000 years ago marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would unfold in ever larger communities, with ever more powerful tools, and with dreams of permanence, prosperity, and civilization. As farming took hold in different parts of the world, it led to a quiet revolution, one that unfolded over centuries. With more food, people began to settle in one place, and these settlements began to grow. What were once seasonal camps became permanent villages, then larger towns, and eventually the first cities. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow transformation driven by necessity, discovery, and the rhythms of nature. The village, humanity's new home. Imagine walking into an early Neolithic village. It's morning, and the air smells of grain, clay, and burning wood. Low, circular houses made of mud brick and thatch line a dusty path. Children chase goats through the courtyards. Women grind grain on heavy stone slabs. Men repair fences, sharpen tools, or dig irrigation ditches. This is a place where life is organized, where people have roles, tasks, and a shared purpose. One of the oldest known villages is Çatalhöyük, in modern-day Turkey, dating back to around 7500 BCE. It wasn't a city yet, but it was far more than a camp. Home to thousands, it had densely packed houses built without streets. Residents walked across rooftops and entered homes through the ceiling. Inside each house was a hearth, sleeping platforms, and shrines decorated with animal skulls and wall paintings. The dead were buried beneath the floors, and some houses were clearly sacred spaces, perhaps temples or homes of spiritual leaders. This was not just a cluster of homes. It was a community,
interconnected, spiritual, and socially organized. The birth of specialization. With farming came surplus food, and with surplus food came free time, or at least the chance for some people to do work beyond just surviving. In early villages, not everyone had to hunt or farm. Some became potters, shaping clay into vessels for storing grain and water. Others became weavers, spinning wool or flax into thread. Some learned to carve wood, bone, or stone into tools and ornaments. A few became healers, midwives, or storytellers. This was the beginning of specialization, when people began to have distinct roles beyond the basic struggle for food, and specialization allowed society to grow more complex. Trade emerged. A village with extra grain might exchange it for obsidian from a volcanic region, or seashells from the coast, or animal skins from the mountains. These exchanges built networks. Information, stories, and tools traveled with the goods. Some individuals accumulated more goods than others. Some became leaders, mediators, or protectors. Others became spiritual guides, interpreting the seasons, the stars, and the forces beyond human control. The role of religion and ritual. As communities grew, so did their belief systems. Humans have always sought meaning, answers to the questions of life, death, and the world beyond the visible. In these early villages, people practiced rituals to ensure good harvests, healthy births, or protection from harm. They built shrines inside their homes or in public spaces. They buried the dead with care, with objects that suggested belief in an afterlife or a spiritual journey. In Çatalhöyük, archaeologists found murals of vultures carrying headless bodies, suggesting complex funerary rituals. Some skulls were plastered and painted, perhaps ancestors honored or remembered. In the Levant, burial sites show repeated patterns of symbolic decoration and grave goods. Across Europe, megalithic structures like Göbekli Tepe, built around 9600 BCE, show monumental architecture long before the rise of cities. Massive stone pillars carved with animals stood in circular enclosures, suggesting shared worship, ceremony, or pilgrimage. What's remarkable is that religion may have preceded agriculture in some places, that the desire to build sacred spaces helped inspire more permanent living. Spirituality was not separate from daily life. It shaped how people viewed illness, weather, animals, fertility, and death. It was woven into every decision, every story, every act of community. Technology takes root. Even in these early times, humans were inventors. They learned to fire clay to make durable pottery. They built irrigation canals to water crops. They shaped stones into grinding tools, axes, and plows. They discovered how to weave baskets, tan hides, and spin thread. In the Near East, people began using obsidian, a glassy volcanic rock, to make ultra-sharp tools. In other regions, they worked with bone, antler, and wood, shaping tools perfectly suited for their environments.
Over generations, these innovations multiplied, and slowly, metalworking began to appear. Copper was among the first metals used, beaten into shape for tools and ornaments. Later, it would be melted and cast, leading to the rise of the Bronze Age. Every advancement brought new possibilities and new challenges. The first hints of government. In a small group of foragers, leadership is usually informal. Decisions are made through consensus or by elders. But in a village of hundreds or thousands, things get more complicated. People need to agree on when to plant, how to share water, who owns what, and how to respond to threats. Disputes must be settled. Rules must be made. In these early communities, we see the seeds of government. Not kingdoms, not yet, but councils, leaders, and systems of organization. Someone, perhaps a respected elder, warrior, or priest, begins to wield influence. Over time, leadership may become hereditary. Roles harden. Power begins to concentrate. This concentration of power was both necessary and dangerous. It could bring order or oppression, cooperation or conflict. The same human story in motion across thousands of years. The importance of the hearth. At the heart of every home in these villages was the hearth. Fire brought warmth, light, protection, and the ability to cook. Around the fire, families gathered. Food was prepared, stories were told, children learned from their elders. The hearth was more than functional, it was sacred. In many cultures, it represented life itself. Its flame was kept alive through generations. In some places, people buried their dead beneath the hearth, keeping ancestors close. The hearth symbolized what villages offered, not just food and shelter, but connection to each other, to the past, and to the unseen world. The challenges of village life. Life in a village was not always peaceful. Drought could destroy crops. Disease could sweep through crowded homes. Conflicts over land or water could erupt. As populations grew, so did the risk of violence, envy, and inequality. Walls were built, not just to keep animals in, but to keep enemies out. Tools became weapons. Spears and arrows were sharpened for war as well as the hunt. But in these tensions, we also see the first stirrings of law, codes of conduct, systems of justice, and shared values. Humans, for all their flaws, longed for order. They created systems to live together, to protect, to trade, to celebrate, and to remember, from village to city. By 7000 to 6000 BCE, some settlements had grown large and complex enough to be called proto-cities. They had thousands of residents, public buildings, organized layouts, and specialized labor. Some had rulers, armies, and religious elites. Trade flourished. Art, writing, and science began to emerge. But in this moment, 10,000 to 8,000 years ago, the world was still mostly rural, quiet, and full of promise. Villages dotted the landscape, connected by trails and trade, each one experimenting with how to live and how to thrive in a changing world. As villages matured and life became more structured, humans began doing something extraordinary, something that separated them from every other species on Earth. They began to record, not just with speech or gesture, but with symbols, marks, images, objects that could hold meaning beyond the moment they were created. This was the beginning of written memory, and with it, the ability to preserve knowledge across generations. The earliest symbols. Long before formal writing, humans were already using symbols. Some date back tens of thousands of years. Abstract marks carved into bone, painted on cave walls, etched into stone. Some of these marks, lines, dots, zigzags, may have been tallies, lunar calendars, or even early maps. Others may have represented rituals, prayers, or tribal identity. Their exact meanings are lost to time, but the intent is clear. These were messages sent from one mind to another across time. As agriculture grew and societies settled, these markings became more organized. In Mesopotamia, people began using clay tablets to track crops, trade, and taxes. They pressed reeds into wet clay, creating wedge-shaped impressions known as cuneiform, one of the world's earliest writing systems. In Egypt, priests used hieroglyphs, complex pictorial symbols that blended art and language. In the Indus Valley, a yet unread script appeared on seals and pottery. In China, early characters were inscribed on oracle bones, used in divination. Each culture developed its own script, suited to its needs. Some systems were phonetic, others were symbolic, but all served one purpose: to extend memory beyond the human mind. Why writing changed everything. Writing transformed the world in subtle but profound ways. Before writing, knowledge had to be passed orally. Each generation relied on the next to remember the past, to recite stories, repeat laws, teach skills. It was beautiful and sacred, but it was fragile. A single lost memory could erase generations of wisdom. With writing, knowledge could be stored, duplicated, and shared. It could travel beyond borders, live beyond lifetimes, and be used to build increasingly complex systems: religion, government, trade, law. A king could issue commands from afar. A merchant could track debts over years. A priest could preserve hymns and myths. A builder could follow blueprints for a temple. Writing made civilization scalable. It allowed large, diverse populations to follow shared rules, values, and visions. It became the glue that held early cities together. Temples, gods, and the sacred order. As villages grew into towns, and towns into cities, something else grew with them: organized religion. Belief had always been part of human life, but now, with more people, more complexity, and more risk, religion became formalized. Temples were built, not just small shrines, but towering monuments of stone and brick. These were not only places of worship, but centers of power, education, and economy. In Mesopotamia, massive stepped pyramids called ziggurats rose above the plains. They were homes to the gods and also to the priests who governed the city in their name. In Egypt, temples lined the Nile, each one a microcosm of the cosmos. Columns represented reeds, ceilings the sky, floors the earth. The pharaoh, a living god, presided over rituals to maintain Ma'at, the divine order. In India, early temples were carved into caves or built from timber, honoring deities associated with nature, fertility, and the cycles of time. Everywhere, people looked to the heavens, to the rivers, to the sun and moon for guidance. They developed rich mythologies, explaining how the world was made, why it changed, and what happened after death. Creation myths and cosmic stories. Creation myths began to take shape, stories that helped people understand the universe and their place in it. In one tradition, the world was born from chaos, shaped by gods who brought light and order. In another, the earth emerged from the body of a slain cosmic serpent. In yet another, a great tree held up the heavens, its roots stretching into the underworld. These stories were not merely entertainment. They were instruction manuals for life, explaining ethics, values, and relationships between humans and the divine. They were told by firelight, sung in ceremonies, carved into temple walls. They provided comfort in times of loss, unity in times of conflict, and purpose in times of uncertainty. And though the details varied across cultures, the themes were often strikingly similar. Creation from chaos, the struggle between order and disorder, death and rebirth, the sacredness of the earth, burial and the afterlife. As belief systems deepened, so did customs surrounding death. Burial sites became increasingly elaborate. In some cultures, the dead were interred with tools, food, ornaments, even animals, suggesting belief in a journey after life. Some tombs were monumental, signaling reverence for the dead and their continued role in the community. In ancient Anatolia, burials were accompanied by painted skulls and ritual offerings. In the Nile Valley, mummification began to appear, an effort to preserve the body for its eternal voyage. The idea of an afterlife, a place beyond the living world, took root in many traditions. Sometimes it was a shadowy realm of ancestors. Sometimes it was a paradise, or a realm of judgment, or a great cycle of rebirth. These beliefs shaped not just how people died, but how they lived. They influenced laws, architecture, art, and behavior. They reminded communities that their actions mattered, that life, was part of something greater: art, music, and the spirit of expression. With more stability came more time for artistic expression. People decorated their pottery, painted their homes, carved intricate amulets, and created music. Flutes made from bone, drums from animal hides, and stringed instruments appeared. Music was used in ritual, in work, and in storytelling. Art was not separate from life. It was part of it. It adorned tools, honored the gods, and marked the passage of seasons and generations. In early societies, artists were not simply creators. They were keepers of memory, builders of identity, and voices of the divine. Through them, a culture could see itself, remember its past, and dream of its future. The great monuments before cities. Before cities rose in brick and stone, humans were already building monuments, vast, mysterious, and awe-inspiring. At Göbekli Tepe, in modern-day Turkey, people carved massive stone pillars over 11,000 years ago, long before agriculture had fully taken hold. These pillars, arranged in circles, are covered with carvings of animals and abstract symbols. There is no evidence of homes nearby, suggesting it was a ceremonial center, a place of pilgrimage and worship. In Western Europe, massive stone circles like Stonehenge began to appear. Aligned with the solstices, these structures were not just architectural marvels. They were calendars, temples, and gathering places. In North America, ancient earthworks like Poverty Point would one day rise, used for ceremonies, trade, or cosmic alignment. These early monuments show that long before empires, humans were builders of meaning. They invested tremendous labor into creating sacred spaces, places where heaven and earth could meet. The power of the spoken word. Though writing was taking shape, most early cultures still relied on the spoken word. Oral tradition was a living library. Elders passed down epics, genealogies, laws, songs, and proverbs. Some stories were so long and detailed that they took days to recite. Others were encoded in chants, dances, or symbols. These stories were dynamic, shaped by each telling. They could grow, shift, or adapt to new times, yet still preserve a core truth. In many cultures, to forget a story was a kind of death. To remember was to keep a people alive. The world was changing, slowly, steadily, over thousands of years. Humanity's scattered villages and seasonal camps began to transform into something new. They became denser, more connected, more intricate, and eventually they became cities. Cities were not simply larger villages, they were something different in kind, not just in scale. In a city, life moved in new rhythms. People didn't just know their neighbors, they also knew the sound of the marketplace, the shape of distant towers, the smell of cooked food drifting from unseen alleys. They felt the pressure of rules and roles and rituals. They belonged to something larger than themselves. Among the first true cities was Uruk, rising from the soil of Mesopotamia over 6,000 years ago. It stood near the banks of the Euphrates River, where fertile land made crops abundant and canals carried water to fields and homes. Uruk was a marvel for its time. Tens of thousands of people lived within its walls. They walked its dusty streets, brought goods to its bustling markets, and bowed before its towering temples. From above, the city must have looked like an orderly hive. Homes clustered together in neighborhoods, long storehouses stretched out beside plazas, and in the heart of it all, a colossal stepped platform, the ziggurat. This structure, reaching high into the sky, was dedicated to the gods and was tended by priests who performed rituals, recorded omens, and made offerings on behalf of the people. Life in Uruk and other early cities was complex in ways humans had never before experienced. People no longer produced everything they needed. Instead, they depended on one another. One person grew grain, another baked bread, one family raised goats, another spun wool, and others still shaped clay into jars, carved stone into tools, or guarded the city's gates from invaders. This interdependence gave rise to something new: specialization. People now had professions. They became potters, scribes, merchants, priests, guards, farmers, and builders. Their identities were no longer shaped solely by family or tribe. They were shaped by trade, skill, and place within the city's invisible structure. But along with this new complexity came new tensions. Not everyone had equal access to land or food. Some accumulated surplus, while others struggled to survive. The gap between rich and poor began to widen. A hierarchy emerged, with rulers at the top, often claiming divine right, followed by nobles, priests, warriors, and then the vast majority of common laborers. Some people lost their freedom entirely and became slaves, owned by others, their lives shaped by forces beyond their control. To manage such a growing and layered society, rules were needed. Oral traditions no longer sufficed. Laws had to be written, enforced, and remembered. Cities created councils, appointed judges, and employed guards. In temples and palaces, scribes kept records, tallies of grain, lists of workers, contracts for trade, and decrees from rulers. These records, etched into clay tablets with styluses or written on parchment, became the backbone of urban life. Writing, once used to mark sacred moments or track lunar cycles, now served the machinery of governance. Bureaucracy was born. It was not glamorous. It was slow, methodical, and often invisible, but it was essential. It ensured that food reached the granaries, that roads were repaired, that labor was organized, and that taxes were collected. Without it, the city would collapse under its own weight. Religious life also evolved within the urban world. In early villages, rituals were personal and local, tied to the land, the ancestors, and the seasons.
In cities, religion became institutional. Great temples rose, staffed by full-time priests and supported by offerings from the populace. These priests interpreted the will of the gods, observed celestial signs, and oversaw festivals that marked the calendar of urban life. The gods themselves changed. No longer were they just spirits of trees, rivers, or animals. In the cities, gods became rulers of the cosmos, kings and queens of heaven, arbiters of fate, guardians of law and order. People feared them, loved them, and built monuments to honor them. And rulers, keen to legitimize their power, often claimed a direct connection to the divine. Kings were not just men, they were chosen, blessed, or even descended from the gods themselves. Art and culture flourished in this environment. With stability came time to create. Walls were painted with murals. Statues were carved from stone and bronze. Music echoed in the courtyards. Stories were told, preserved, and passed down through generations. Myth, history, and poetry became part of public life. Trade linked cities to one another. Donkeys and oxen pulled carts across dusty roads. Boats moved along rivers and coastlines. Goods flowed. Obsidian from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, linen from Egypt. But it wasn't just goods that moved. Ideas traveled too. Knowledge of farming techniques, new tools, foreign stories, and fresh beliefs spread along these routes, slowly knitting the ancient world together. But city life had its costs. Crowding brought disease. Pollution fouled the air and water. Waste accumulated. Conflict simmered in the alleys and behind palace doors. When resources ran low or leadership faltered, unrest could break into open violence. And when cities grew too large or too dependent on fragile systems, they sometimes fell, collapsing under the weight of their own ambition. Still, the experiment continued. Cities multiplied. Across the Middle East, South Asia, China, Africa, and the Americas, urban centers rose in response to geography, necessity, and vision. Each one was unique, shaped by its environment and culture, but all shared certain patterns: walls for protection, temples for worship, records for control, and communities built on shared labor. The birth of cities was not just a political or economic event. It was a transformation of consciousness. Humanity had moved from the rhythm of nature to the rhythm of society, from the simplicity of kinship to the complexity of governance, from the freedom of the wild to the structures of civilization. This shift, once begun, would continue to echo forward in time. It changed how people saw themselves, their world, and their gods, and it laid the foundations for every society that would follow. As cities solidified their place on the landscape, the idea of civilization began to spread. Across vast regions, people built upon the foundations of those first urban experiments, taking with them new ideas, new structures, and new hopes. In the river valleys of the world,
complex societies began to rise. The Nile in Egypt, the Indus in South Asia, the Yellow River in China, all nurtured civilizations that would define entire eras. Each developed writing systems, religious traditions, monumental architecture, and intricate social hierarchies, all shaped by the land around them. In Egypt, life clung to the edges of the river. Here, kings ruled as divine pharaohs, their monuments, pyramids, obelisks, and temples rising from the desert like promises to the gods. The Nile's predictable floods brought life, allowing agriculture to flourish, and in turn, supported a centralized state that lasted for millennia. Further east, the people of the Indus Valley built cities with straight streets, uniform bricks, and advanced sanitation. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa showed an extraordinary level of urban planning, yet left behind no deciphered texts. Much of their lives remains a mystery, a silence carved in stone. In China, early dynasties were forming. Bronze tools, oracle bones, and ancestral worship gave shape to their world. Communities grew under the guidance of strong families, with rulers seen not just as political leaders, but as cosmic mediators. Trade routes lengthened. Goods crossed deserts, mountains, and seas. With them went stories, beliefs, and technologies. A shared human fabric was slowly being woven, thread by thread. People were becoming aware of one another across vast distances. Though conflict was ever present, so too was cooperation. Temples, markets, and city halls echoed with voices, not just of kings and priests, but of farmers, merchants, scribes, and dreamers. Civilizations were not just built by power, they were shaped by the quiet, daily work of ordinary people. The pulse of human life now beat through the hearts of cities and across the arteries of rivers and trade routes. What had begun as small steps, planting seeds, building homes, telling stories, had become the march of history itself. As grand temples rose and kings carved their names into stone, the world's first civilizations grew stronger, more organized and more complex. But beneath the surface of empires and palaces, it was the everyday rhythm of ordinary people that truly kept societies alive. These were the farmers who woke before sunrise, the potters kneeling over their wheels, the shepherds guiding flocks beneath open skies. They were mothers, builders, scribes, cooks, weavers, healers. And though their names are largely lost to history, their lives made up the vast majority of human experience during these early centuries of civilization. In the countryside, days were shaped by the sun and the soil. Farmers rose early to work the fields, especially near the great rivers where agriculture had taken hold. The Nile, the Tigris, the Indus, the Yellow River. Each flowed with water and silt, renewing the land and dictating the pace of the seasons. People dug irrigation canals, harvested with flint-bladed sickles, and stored grain in clay jars or stone silos. They kept livestock, tended gardens, and gathered wild herbs. Work was hard and unending, but it was grounded in the cycles of the earth.
planting, growing, harvesting, resting. In cities, life was different. It moved faster, surrounded by noise, structure, and layers of authority. Markets bustled with voices and colour. Merchants shouted their prices. Children chased dogs between stalls of spices, cloth, tools, and grain. Bakers kneaded dough near glowing ovens. Smiths pounded bronze and copper into tools and weapons. Women wove fabric in courtyards or carried baskets to the temples. In the evenings, the city slowed. Oil lamps flickered in narrow windows. Meals were shared around low tables. Stories were told of gods, ancestors, and distant wars. Laughter sometimes filled the night. So did silence. Families lived in simple homes, mud brick or timber, often with flat roofs used for sleeping in the summer heat. Privacy was limited, but so was loneliness. People lived tightly together, depending on neighbors, kin, and community for survival. Education was rare, but in some cities, young boys were taught to read and write, especially the sons of scribes and priests. They memorized symbols, copied records, and learned to interpret omens or calculate trade. Writing, still a rare skill, was both a tool and a form of power. Women's roles varied by region and class. In some places, they ran households and family businesses. In others, they served as priestesses or midwives. Some were powerful in their own right, landowners, poets, or even rulers, but most lived within social structures shaped by tradition, religion, and the expectations of male authority. Religion remained central to everyday life. Temples weren't just for worship. They were economic engines. They owned land, employed workers, and collected taxes. People brought offerings of grain, oil, and wine, hoping for blessings, good harvests, healthy children, safe journeys. Festivals filled the calendar. They marked the new year, the flooding of rivers, the sowing of crops, and the changing of seasons. Entire cities came alive with processions, dances, music, and ritual. These were not just religious observances. They were shared moments of identity and belonging. Despite the rituals and order, life was never easy. Droughts could bring famine. Disease could sweep through crowded homes. Raids or war could destroy years of work in a single night. Most people lived on the edge of survival, and yet they continued, generation after generation. What drove them? Likely the same things that still move people today: love, hope, fear, duty. They wanted their children to live better lives. They found meaning in relationships, in work, in beauty, in faith. They endured hardship not because they were immune to pain, but because they had no other choice. Their world was both smaller and more mysterious. The horizon was the edge of everything known. The sky was a ceiling filled with gods. Death was near, but so was wonder. Art grew from this wonder. People carved figures from stone and wood. They painted walls, shaped pottery, strung beads, and embroidered patterns into cloth. Some of these creations were sacred. Others were just expressions of beauty, made to be held, worn, or passed down. Music was ever present. Drums, flutes, harps, and voices echoed in temples and streets. Songs were sung to soothe infants, celebrate harvests, mourn the dead, and call out to the gods. Stories, too, wove through everything. Even those who could not read had access to an oral tradition rich with metaphor, wisdom, and humor. Myths explained the creation of the world. Legends told of great heroes and battles. Proverbs passed along lessons in clever, memorable lines. These stories were not just entertainment. They were a kind of inheritance, a way to pass down memory, culture, and identity. They told people who they were, where they came from, and what mattered. Over time, even as empires rose and fell, the essence of these lives remained. The tools changed. The languages evolved, but the heartbeat of daily human experience, work, family, love, loss, belief, echoed on. The builders of the pyramids, the mothers of Babylon, the potters of the Yellow River, the shepherds of Anatolia, they lived lives filled with motion and stillness, hope and struggle, much like people today. They did not know what the future would bring, but in their hands they held the weight of the past and the fragile beginnings of what we now call civilization. Long before trains, ships, or satellites, long before there were nation-states or passports, ancient humans had already begun to connect. Though separated by deserts, mountains, oceans, and vast forests, the people of the ancient world were not isolated. Slowly, steadily, they began to trade, travel, and tell stories across the landscape of the earth. Ideas crossed borders, goods passed from hand to hand, and languages mingled in the mouths of travelers. The oldest trade routes were not paved roads or grand highways. They were simple footpaths, marked by stone cairns or worn by generations of footsteps. Over time, they became arteries of commerce and culture. Obsidian from Anatolia might end up in a settlement hundreds of miles away. Seashells from the coast were found inland, buried in graves. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan glimmered in the temples of Mesopotamia. This web of exchange didn't just carry objects, it carried knowledge. How to shape tools, how to build with stone, how to grow unfamiliar crops. A technique developed in one region might appear in another a generation later, transformed by local customs and adapted to new conditions. Traders were among the first to experience the world beyond their homeland. They brought back more than goods. They brought stories. Tales of foreign cities, strange beasts, marvelous inventions. These stories, embroidered with wonder and caution, would shape myths and histories alike. One of the earliest and most enduring examples of cultural exchange was the diffusion of metallurgy. Copper tools first emerged in the Near East, but soon the knowledge of how to extract and shape metal spread across continents. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, became a symbol of advancement. With it came sharper tools, stronger weapons, and new artistic possibilities. Language, too, was a vehicle of connection. Even when people didn't speak the same tongue, they found ways to communicate through signs, gestures, shared rituals, or a patchwork of borrowed words. In places where different cultures met regularly, pidgin languages or trade dialects developed, blending elements of each group's speech. The expansion of languages over large areas tells a story of migration and mingling. The early spread of Indo-European languages, for instance, links people from northern India to Western Europe. This spread didn't happen overnight. It unfolded over centuries of slow movement, intermarriage, and adaptation. In these early times, migration was a constant theme. Sometimes it was peaceful, groups moving in search of better land, more water, or richer soil. Sometimes it was forced, driven by drought, disease, or conflict. But wherever people went, they left behind traces of themselves and absorbed parts of the world they entered. Villages along these travel corridors became multicultural spaces, nodes where customs merged and new traditions took shape. A new tool, a new song, a new kind of bread. People adapted, blended, and carried the results forward. Religion also traveled these paths. Gods crossed borders, names changed, rituals adapted. A fertility goddess in one land became a harvest deity in another. Sun gods rose in many cultures, each reflecting local needs and fears, yet sharing something universal, a reverence for the source of light and life. Even the stars were shared. People across the world looked up and saw the same constellations. They traced patterns in the sky, told stories about Orion and the Pleiades, imagined cosmic animals and divine messengers. Though the names differed, the sky was a common canvas for wonder. Over time, some places became centers of connection, places where multiple routes met and where ideas converged. These were the hubs of ancient globalization, a port city on the Mediterranean, a caravan stop along a desert trail, a riverside town at the edge of empire. Here, a traveler might find merchants from many regions, hear multiple languages in the market, taste spices from distant lands. In these places, people learned to live alongside strangers. They navigated difference, built bridges of trust, and sometimes created entirely new cultures. These networks, fragile as they were, helped accelerate human development. They helped people solve problems with shared insight, blend art and science, expand diets and
healing practices, and imagine worlds beyond their own. The ancient world was not yet unified, but it was no longer scattered. The threads were being woven. And though most people never traveled far from where they were born, the ripple effects of distant lands reached their homes all the same. In time, these threads would form the foundation of something larger. Empires would rise, spanning continents. Religions would spread across oceans. Languages would evolve and diversify. But all of it began with these early steps, humble, brave, and deeply human. For all their brilliance, early civilizations were fragile. Beneath the temples and markets, the stories and inventions, there were always risks. Crops could fail. Rivers could flood too much or too little. Leaders could grow greedy or foolish. And when these pressures grew too great, cities fell. Collapse didn't always come through war or catastrophe. Often it was slow, a quiet unraveling. Trade would falter, people would leave, walls would crumble, and memory would fade. Forests would reclaim roads. Fields would return to wild grass. A place once filled with light and voices would go silent. But collapse wasn't the end. People moved. They adapted. They remembered. In many places, new cultures rose from the old. They built on the ruins, reused stones, reimagined gods. They kept some traditions and let others go. Sometimes what followed was stronger, wiser, shaped by the lessons of failure. This rhythm of growth, collapse, and renewal echoed across centuries. It's part of the human story. We rise, we stumble, we rebuild, and each time we carry forward something new. From scattered bands of foragers to the builders of cities and temples, humanity's journey over the past 10,000 years has been one of transformation. We began with little more than stone tools, simple stories, and a deep curiosity about the world around us. And yet, over time, we built civilizations, crafted languages, shaped art, and imagined gods who watched over the stars. But despite all the change, much has stayed the same. We still gather around warmth, whether a fire, a lamp, or a screen, seeking connection, comfort, and understanding. We still tell stories, mark time, and wonder what lies beyond the sky. We still face hardship and rebuild, fall short and try again. We still sing, mourn, dance, and dream. The people of 10,000 years ago were not so different from us. They loved their children. They feared the dark. They laughed with their friends. They held memories close and watched the seasons pass with awe. They built because they hoped. They planted because they believed in tomorrow. What we call history is not just a list of names or battles.
It is the layered memory of being human. A memory carried in bones and rivers, in pottery and prayer, in stories whispered from parent to child. When we look back, we're not just studying the past, we're remembering something of ourselves, our shared origins, our long endurance, and the beauty of everything we've become. Though the world has changed in 1,000 ways, that long thread continues. It runs through the first footprint on soft earth, through the first line carved in clay, and through you now as you rest and listen, part of the same story. Sleep well. You're not alone in time. You're connected to everything that came before and everything still to come.